The wagon wheels carved deep ruts through the spring mud as they lurched toward the cluster of cabins nestled against the Montana foothills. 8-year-old Emma clutched her bundle of belongings, a faded dress, her mama's wooden comb, and the torn letter that had sealed her fate. The Orphan train had deposited her in Billings 3 days prior, where the territorial representative had shuffled through his papers with growing irritation. The 7th cabin, Bear Creek Settlement, he'd muttered, not bothering to look at her properly. The Hartwell place. They're expecting a boy for farm work, but they'll have to make do. The driver, a weathered man named Pete who chewed tobacco and spoke little, had agreed to transport her for $2, money the territory provided for such arrangements. Emma had learned not to ask questions during the long journey west. Questions only brought disappointment or worse, and she'd endured enough of both to last several lifetimes. The Orphan train had been a nightmare of crying children, desperate families, and quick judgments. Emma had watched from the wooden benches as other children were selected, the strong boys for farm work, the pretty girls for domestic help, the youngest ones by couples seeking to fill empty nurseries. She'd stood on platform after platform, her hands folded properly, her dress as clean as she could manage, hope dying a little more at each stop. Next one, families would say, looking past her to younger, more appealing options. Too old, others muttered. Too thin. Look at those eyes, too knowing for her age. Emma had learned to keep her gaze downcast, to make herself small and unassuming, but it hadn't helped. By the time they reached the end of the line in Montana Territory, she was one of only 3 children remaining, and the territorial representative had seemed annoyed by their very existence. As they approached the settlement now, Emma counted the cabins scattered along Bear Creek. 1, 2, 3. Her stomach twisted with familiar dread, the same knot that had formed every time she'd been moved from one temporary home to another. Would these people be kind? Would they feed her enough? Would they let her keep Mama's wooden comb, the only thing she had left of her old life? The questions churned like butter in her mind, but she kept them locked behind pressed lips. That there's cabin 6, Pete announced, pointing with his chin toward a modest log structure with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Light glowed golden through oiled paper windows, and Emma could hear the faint sound of voices within. And that one's 7. Emma's heart sank as she looked at the 7th cabin. The windows were dark, covered with boards. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the door hung slightly askew on its hinges, revealing darkness within. The small garden plot was overgrown with weeds, and debris scattered across the front porch suggested the place had been abandoned for some time. It looked forgotten, forsaken, much like she felt. Pete pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down, his joints creaking like old leather. He studied the abandoned cabin with obvious displeasure, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the muddy ground. "Don't look like nobody's home," he observed, scratching his grizzled head beneath his worn hat. "You sure this is right, girl?" Emma produced the wrinkled paper with trembling fingers, reading aloud in her careful schoolgirl voice. "The 7th cabin, Bear Creek Settlement. The Hartwell family." The words seemed to mock her now, written in the territorial representative's hasty scrawl. Pete shook his head and hefted her small bundle from the wagon bed, setting it beside her feet in the mud. "Well, I ain't waitin' around. Got to get back to Billings before dark, and there's weather coming." He climbed back onto the wagon seat, already reaching for the reins. "Good luck to you, girl. Maybe try the neighbors." The wagon disappeared down the muddy track, leaving Emma alone in the gathering dusk with nothing but her meager belongings and a growing sense of despair. The Montana sky stretched endless overhead, painted in shades of purple and gold as the sun sank behind the mountains. In the distance, a wolf howled, reminding her of just how isolated this place truly was. She stood before the abandoned cabin for several long minutes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. This was supposed to be her new home, her fresh start, her chance to finally belong somewhere. Instead, she found herself once again displaced, unwanted, with nowhere to go. The sound of laughter drifted from cabin 6, warm and welcoming in the cold evening air. Emma looked toward the glowing windows, her heart aching with longing. Inside that cabin was warmth, family, belonging, everything she'd dreamed of but never quite managed to grasp. Taking her courage in both hands, She picked up her bundle and approached the door of the 6th cabin. Her small fist hesitated before the rough wooden door, and for a moment she almost lost her nerve. What if they turned her away? What if they had no room, no food, no patience for a stray child who'd appeared on their doorstep? But the growing darkness and the distant howl of wolves left her little choice. She knocked softly, her knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. "Come in," called a woman's voice, warm and welcoming. Emma pushed open the door and stepped into a scene that made her heart ache with longing so intense it took her breath away. The cabin was everything the abandoned one was not: warm, clean, filled with the soft glow of oil lamps and the comforting smell of cooking food. A woman with kind brown eyes and prematurely gray hair looked up from her mending, while a man with gentle hands and work-worn clothes paused in his Bible reading. They were both younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, and something about their faces spoke of deep sadness carefully hidden beneath pleasant smiles. "Oh my," the woman breathed, setting down her needle and half rising from her chair. "You're just a child." "I'm Emma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was sent to cabin 7, to the Hartwell family, but nobody's there. The cabin's all broken up and empty." The man and woman exchanged a meaningful glance that Emma had learned to recognize, the look adults shared when discussing what to do with an unwanted child. Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. "The Hartwells moved on last fall," the man said gently, closing his Bible and marking his place with a ribbon. "There was a fire that took most of their crops, and then little Mary took sick. They lost everything and decided to try their luck in Oregon Territory." "I'm Sarah Fletcher," the woman said, rising from her chair and moving toward Emma with outstretched hands. "This is my husband, Daniel. You must be cold and hungry, dear one." Emma nodded, though she'd learned not to expect much from adults' initial kindness. It often turned to irritation once they realized the extent of their unexpected burden. "I won't be no trouble," she said quickly. "I can work real good. I can cook some and clean, and I don't eat much. The folks at the orphanage said I was useful." Sarah's eyes filled with unexpected tears, which she quickly brushed away with the back of her hand. "Sit yourself down, child. When did you last have a proper meal?" Emma tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Pete, the wagon driver, he shared some jerky and hardtack with me, but before that." She trailed off, not wanting to admit just how hungry she was. Time had become fluid since leaving the orphanage, measured only by the rumbling of her empty stomach, the ache in her feet, and the growing certainty that she was unwanted wherever she went. The orphanage hadn't been pleasant, but at least it had provided regular meals and a roof over her head. Now she had neither. Without another word, Sarah bustled to the kitchen area, pulling out fresh bread and cold meat, preserves that gleamed like jewels in glass jars, and rich milk from their cow. The sight of so much food made Emma's mouth water, but she tried to maintain some dignity even as her stomach cramped with hunger. Daniel set aside his Bible and studied Emma with eyes that held no calculation, no assessment of her potential usefulness as a servant or field hand, only compassion. She wasn't used to being looked at that way, as if she mattered simply because she was a child in need. "Where did you come from, Emma?" he asked, his voice gentle and patient. "The orphanage in Chicago," she replied, accepting the plate Sarah pressed into her hands with trembling fingers. "Before that, I lived with my mama in a tenement house, but she died of the consumption last winter. They put me on the train with lots of other children, and families picked us out at different stops like we was goods for sale. Nobody picked me until we got to the end of the line, and then the territory man said I had to go to the Hartwells because they needed help with farm work." Emma attacked the food with desperate hunger, trying to maintain some semblance of table manners while her body screamed for sustenance. The bread was soft and fresh, nothing like the stale crusts she'd grown accustomed to. The meat was tender, the preserves sweet enough to make her eyes water with gratitude, and the milk was rich and creamy. She had to force herself to eat slowly, though every instinct urged her to consume as much as possible before it was taken away. Sarah returned with a plate piled even higher with food, more than Emma had seen in months. The territory man didn't know the Hartwells had moved on? Emma shook her head, pausing in her eating to answer. I don't think he cared much. He had a whole stack of papers and kept mixing them up, getting names wrong and such. He seemed mighty put out that there were still children left at the end, like we was causing him trouble on purpose. What will happen to you now? Sarah asked softly, settling into the chair across from Emma. Will you have to go back to Chicago? Emma's appetite vanished at the question, though she forced herself to keep eating. I don't rightly know, ma'am. I suppose I'll have to go wherever they send me next. Sometimes children get moved around a lot before they find a place that'll keep them. Daniel and Sarah exchanged another look, this one longer and more complex. Emma had seen such looks before, when adults debated whether she was worth the trouble of keeping, whether they could afford another mouth to feed, whether she might prove useful enough to justify her presence. You'll stay here tonight, Sarah said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. It's full dark now, and there's wolves about. Tomorrow we'll sort things out proper. I can sleep in the barn, Emma offered quickly, not wanting to impose any more than necessary. I won't be no bother. I'm used to sleeping rough. You'll sleep in a proper bed, Sarah replied with a tone that reminded Emma of her mother, firm but loving. We've got a spare room that's been. She paused, her voice catching slightly. That's been waiting for someone to use it. As Emma finished her meal, Sarah heated water and prepared a warm bath behind a canvas curtain strung across one corner of the cabin. The luxury of hot water and real soap made Emma's eyes well with tears. When had anyone last cared whether she was clean? At the orphanage, baths had been weekly affairs conducted with cold water and harsh lye soap that left her skin raw and stinging. I've put out a clean nightgown for you, Sarah called through the curtain. It might be a bit long, but it'll do for tonight. The nightgown was soft cotton, worn smooth by many washings, and it smelled of lavender and sunshine. Emma pulled it over her head and marveled at the feeling of clean fabric against clean skin. The simple pleasure of being warm and clean seemed almost too good to be true. When she emerged from behind the curtain, she found Sarah turning down the covers of a real bed with white sheets and handmade quilts. The sight of it took her breath away. She hadn't slept in a proper bed since her mother died. This is too fine for me, Emma protested, her voice small with uncertainty. I ain't used to such nice things. Every child deserves a warm bed and clean sheets, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Come now, let's get you settled. The bed was softer than anything Emma could remember. The quilts were lovingly handmade, stitched with intricate patterns of flowers and birds, and they smelled of cedar and care. Sarah tucked her in with gentle hands, smoothing the covers and brushing Emma's freshly washed hair away from her face with tender fingers. Sleep well, dear one, Sarah whispered, pressing a soft kiss to Emma's forehead, the first such gesture of affection she'd received since her mother's death. But as Sarah moved toward the door, Emma heard Daniel's voice calling softly from the main room. Sarah, might I have a word? Emma lay still beneath the warm quilts, straining to hear their whispered conversation through the thin cabin walls. Their voices were low, but in the stillness of the night, she could make out most of their words. We can't keep her, Daniel. Sarah's voice was tight with pain. The territory will send someone to collect her when they realize their mistake. And if we let ourselves get attached. Look at her, Sarah. She's been neglected, maybe worse. Those clothes were little more than rags, and she's thin as a rail. When's the last time someone showed that child proper kindness? I know. Lord help me, I know. Sarah's voice broke slightly. But we can't just decide to keep a child that ain't ours. There's laws about such things, procedures that have to be followed. Laws made by men who've never looked into the eyes of a hungry child, Daniel replied, his voice firm but gentle. Laws that sent her to an empty cabin with no provision for her care. There was a long silence, and Emma held her breath, afraid to move lest she miss their words. You know why I can't bear this, Sarah whispered, and her voice cracked with years of suppressed anguish. Every time I see a child, every time I hold one or care for one, it tears my heart anew. We've tried for 8 years, Daniel. 8 long years of hoping and praying and losing hope again. 8 years of empty cradles and broken dreams. Emma's heart clenched with understanding. She'd seen this pain before in other women, the hollow look of mothers who had no children to mother, the aching emptiness that no amount of kindness could quite fill. "I know, my love," Daniel said softly. "But maybe this is the answer we've been praying for. Maybe the Lord works through territorial mistakes as well as miracles." "Don't say that. Don't give me false hope." Sarah's voice was barely audible now. "They'll come for her, Daniel. And when they do, when they take her away to some stranger who might not care for her proper, it'll kill me to let her go." Emma squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the quilt over her head, trying to muffle the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs. She'd heard such conversations before, at other homes where she'd been temporarily placed. Adults always talked as if she couldn't hear, as if she didn't understand what it meant when they said she couldn't stay. But something about Sarah and Daniel Fletcher felt different from the other families who'd housed her temporarily. The way Sarah had tucked her in, the gentle way Daniel had spoken to her, the care they'd taken to make her comfortable, these weren't the actions of people who saw her as merely an obligation or a burden to be endured. For the first time in months, Emma dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found people who might want to keep her not because she was useful, but because she was a child who needed love. She woke before dawn to the sound of Sarah moving quietly in the kitchen, banking the fire and starting preparations for breakfast. Through the small window beside her bed, she could see Daniel in the gray morning light, milking their cow with practiced efficiency. Everything about this place spoke of peace and order, of love carefully tended like a well-kept garden. Emma dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Sarah had somehow found time to wash and mend during the night. When she emerged from the bedroom, Sarah turned from the stove with a smile that seemed forced around the edges, as if she'd been crying and was trying to hide it. "Good morning, dear one. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am. Better than I have in a very long time." Emma hesitated, then added softly, "Thank you for the bed. And the nightgown. And everything." "You're welcome, sweet child." Sarah's voice was gentle but strained. "Are you hungry? I've got biscuits in the oven and eggs from our hens." Emma nodded, settling at the rough wooden table that dominated the cabin's main room. Through the window, she watched Daniel working with practiced movements, speaking softly to the cow as he worked. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that spoke of contentment and routine built over years of shared life. "He's got a way with animals," Sarah observed, following Emma's gaze. "Always has, ever since he was a boy. He wanted to be a veterinarian when he was young, but there wasn't money for such schooling." "What does he do now?" "He's the blacksmith for the settlement and the surrounding ranches, shoes horses, mends tools, makes whatever folks need made. It's good work, steady work. And in the evenings, he reads to me from books." Sarah's voice carried a note of pride and love that made Emma's chest tight with longing. Daniel came in then, carrying a pail of fresh milk, and smiled warmly at Emma. "Sleep well, little one?" "Yes, sir. Thank you kindly for letting me stay." He washed his hands at the basin and joined them at the table. Sarah served breakfast, fluffy biscuits with real butter and strawberry jam, scrambled eggs still warm from the pan, and glasses of rich, sweet milk. Emma ate slowly, savoring each bite and trying not to think about when this wonderful interlude would end. "Emma," Daniel said gently, his voice careful and kind, "we need to talk about what comes next." Her stomach clenched with familiar dread, though she tried to keep eating. "Yes, sir. The territory made a mistake sending you here. The Hartwells are long gone, and there's no telling when someone might come looking for you to sort out the confusion. We need to decide what's best for everyone." Emma set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "I understand, sir. If you'll just tell me which way to go to the next settlement, I can manage on my own. I don't want to be trouble for you folks." "Walk." Sarah's voice rose in alarm. "Child, you're not walking anywhere alone. It's 30 miles to the next town through rough country, and there's wolves and bears and worse between here and there. A child alone wouldn't last a day." I don't want to be a burden, Emma said, though her voice trembled with fear and disappointment. I know you got your own concerns and your own life to live. Daniel reached across the table and covered her small hand with his large, calloused one. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and completely without calculation. You're not a burden, Emma. You're a blessing we didn't know we were waiting for. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she couldn't quite hide. Daniel. I know what we discussed last night, Sarah. But look at her. Look at this child, and tell me we can send her away to strangers who might not care for her proper. But the law. The law sent her to an empty cabin with no provision for her care. The law failed this child before she ever reached our door. Daniel's voice grew firm but remained gentle. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right. Emma looked between them, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope too much. She'd been disappointed so many times before that hope had become a dangerous luxury she could rarely afford. What are you saying, Daniel? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm saying maybe the territory made exactly the mistake the good Lord intended. Maybe Emma was meant to find her way to our door, not the Hartwells. Sarah stood abruptly and moved to the window, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Daniel rose and went to her, placing his hands gently on her arms. Emma watched them, these two people who had shown her more kindness in one night than she'd received in months. Sarah, love, Daniel said softly, his voice meant for his wife but carrying to Emma's ears. We've prayed for 8 years for a child. 8 years we've asked the Almighty to bless us with someone to love and raise and call our own. Maybe this is His answer, even if it doesn't look like what we expected. But she's not. We can't just. Sarah's voice broke. Can't what? Love her. Protect her. Give her the home she needs and deserves. Emma couldn't stand the tension any longer. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. I'll be real good. I promise I will. I know how to work hard, and I won't cause trouble. I can learn whatever you need me to learn, and I'll help with everything. I won't be a burden, I swear it. Sarah turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. Oh, sweet child. It's not about being good. You're already perfect just as you are. Then why can't I stay? The question came out smaller than Emma intended, but it carried all her longing, all her fear of being unwanted once again. The question hung in the air like smoke from the chimney, heavy with meaning. Daniel and Sarah looked at each other across the small room, and Emma could see a lifetime of shared dreams and disappointments passing between them in that single glance. Because, Sarah said slowly, her voice thick with pain, if we let ourselves love you the way we already do, and then someone comes to take you away. Nobody's coming, Emma said with the certainty of a child who had learned to read the winds of adult intention. The territory man didn't even look at me proper when he sent me here. He just wanted me off his list so he could go home to his supper. And the Hartwells are gone clear to Oregon. Nobody knows where I am except you. Daniel sat back down at the table, pulling Emma's chair closer to his. If you stayed, Emma, really stayed, not just for a few days but for always, what would you want most? Emma thought carefully before answering, knowing that her words might determine her entire future. To belong somewhere. To have people who know my name and care if I come home at night. To help with the work and know that my helping matters. To maybe learn my letters better, if you've got books to spare. And to. She hesitated, then continued in a whisper. To have a mama and papa again. We've got books, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Shelves full of them. And we've got work that needs doing around here, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden. And we've got hearts that are already full of love for you, though we've only known you one night. But the law, Emma said, echoing Sarah's earlier concern. The law, Daniel said firmly, says that children need homes and families to care for them. If someone comes asking questions, we'll tell them the truth, that you came to us in need, and we provided for you as Christian folks should. That we filed proper papers and made legal arrangements. Beyond that, we'll trust the Lord to handle the details. Sarah returned to the table and knelt beside Emma's chair, taking the child's hands in her own. "Emma, dear one, if you want to stay with us, really stay, forever and always, if you want to be our daughter in all the ways that matter, then that's what we want too. You mean it. You really, truly mean it." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "We mean it with all our hearts," Daniel said solemnly. "We'll ride to the territorial office and file papers, make it all legal and proper. We'll write to the orphanage in Chicago and tell them you've been placed permanently. But in our hearts, you're already our daughter." Emma threw her arms around Sarah's neck, finally allowing the tears to come. Tears of relief, of joy, of hope fulfilled beyond her wildest dreams. Sarah held her tightly, her own tears falling into Emma's clean hair. "We love you, Emma," Sarah whispered fiercely. "We've loved you since the moment you walked through our door looking so lost and brave." Through her tears, Emma heard Daniel's voice, rough with emotion. "Welcome home, daughter. Welcome home to stay." Outside, the spring sun climbed higher into the vast Montana sky, warming the earth and promising new growth, new beginnings, new life. In the small cabin beside Bear Creek, 3 hearts that had been separate and searching began to beat in the rhythm of family, and the administrative mistake that had brought them together revealed itself to be the kind of miracle that heaven sometimes disguises as human error. The territorial representative's careless documentation had sent an orphan to the wrong cabin, but in the mysterious and providential ways of the Almighty, it had sent her to exactly the right home, to the people who needed her just as much as she needed them. The weeks that followed Emma's arrival passed like a sweet dream she was afraid to wake from. Spring melted into early summer, and with each passing day, the Fletcher homestead felt more like home than any place she'd ever known. Sarah taught her to churn butter and tend the vegetable garden, while Daniel showed her how to care for the animals and mend simple tools. Every evening after supper, they would gather around the table while Daniel read aloud from books Emma had never imagined existed. Stories of adventure and distant lands, poems that made her heart soar, and passages from Scripture that spoke of God's love for His children. "You're a quick learner, Emma," Sarah said one morning as they worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans and squash. "Your mama taught you well before she passed." Emma's hands stilled on the soil. She rarely spoke of her mother anymore, the memories too precious and painful to share casually. She said reading was the key to everything. That no matter how poor we were, books could take us anywhere we wanted to go. "She was a wise woman," Sarah replied gently, not pressing for more details. "Would you like to write a letter to her grave? Sometimes it helps to put our thoughts on paper, even when the person can't write back." The idea had never occurred to Emma, but it felt right somehow. That evening, while Daniel worked on repairing a neighbor's plow by lamplight, Sarah sat with Emma at the kitchen table and helped her compose a letter to her mother's memory. Emma's handwriting was still uncertain, but the words came from her heart. "Dear Mama," she wrote slowly, forming each letter with care. "I found a family like you always said I would. They love me and want to keep me forever. I think you would like them very much. I miss you every day, but I'm not scared anymore." Sarah had to step outside when Emma read the letter aloud, and when she returned, her eyes were red but her smile was radiant. "Your mama would be so proud of the young lady you're becoming." The letter was carefully folded and placed in Sarah's cedar chest alongside other precious documents: Daniel and Sarah's marriage certificate, deeds to their land, and the adoption papers they'd filed with the territorial office just 2 weeks after Emma's arrival. The clerk had been suspicious at first, questioning why the Fletchers suddenly wanted to adopt when they'd never expressed such interest before, but Daniel's reputation as an honest man and Sarah's obvious devotion to Emma had eventually swayed him. "Papers are just papers," Daniel had said as they rode home from the territorial office that day. "But love is what makes a family real." By midsummer, Emma had settled into the rhythm of homestead life as if she'd been born to it. She helped Sarah preserve vegetables from their abundant garden, learning to can beans and corn, to dry herbs and store root vegetables in the cool cellar Daniel had dug behind the house. She gathered eggs from their chickens each morning, speaking to them in the soft, patient voice Sarah had taught her to use with animals. "They lay better when they feel safe," Sarah explained as Emma carefully lifted warm eggs from the nesting boxes. Animals can sense fear and anger just like people can. Speak gentle, move slow, and they'll trust you. The wisdom applied to more than chickens, Emma discovered. The neighboring families had initially been curious about the sudden appearance of a child at the Fletcher homestead, but Emma's quiet manners and willing helpfulness gradually won them over. Mrs. Petty, who lived 2 miles downstream, began asking Sarah to bring Emma along when she came calling. Old Tom Bradley, whose arthritis made shoeing his horses difficult, praised Emma's steady hand when she helped Daniel at the forge. "That girl's got a good heart and willing hands," he told Daniel one afternoon as Emma carefully held a horse's hoof while Daniel fitted a new shoe. "You and Sarah are blessed to have her." But it was the children of the settlement who truly accepted Emma without reservation. There were only a handful of them scattered across the valley: the Petty twins, Mary and Matthew, who were close to Emma's age; young Billy Henderson, barely 6 and full of mischief; and teenager Susan Crawford, who took Emma under her wing like an older sister. "Want to see something special?" Susan asked one afternoon when she'd come to visit while her father conducted business with Daniel. She led Emma to a hidden grove of cottonwoods along the creek, where wild roses bloomed in profusion and the sound of water over stones created a peaceful sanctuary. "This is where I come when I need to think," Susan confided as they settled on a fallen log. "My ma says every girl needs a secret place where she can be herself." Emma understood immediately. At the orphanage, privacy had been impossible, and even here at the Fletcher place, she sometimes felt the need to process her happiness, to make sure it was real and lasting. The grove became her refuge, a place where she could write in the journal Sarah had given her and practice reading aloud without fear of making mistakes. As summer progressed into early autumn, Emma's life with the Fletchers took on a comfortable predictability that she treasured. Morning chores, lessons with Sarah, helping Daniel when needed, evening reading time, and prayers before bed. It was a simple life, but it was hers, and every day she felt more secure in her place within it. That security was first threatened on a crisp September morning when a stranger rode into the settlement asking questions. Emma was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of an unfamiliar horse approaching. Through the fluttering sheets, she caught sight of a well-dressed man in a dark suit and city hat, the kind of man who represented authority and bureaucracy. Her blood turned cold as childhood instincts kicked in. Men like this one had taken her from her mother's deathbed, had loaded her onto the orphan train, had shuffled her from place to place like a piece of unwanted cargo. She crept closer to the cabin wall, straining to hear the conversation taking place on the front porch. "Good morning," the stranger was saying to Daniel, who had emerged from his forge to greet the visitor. "I'm looking for information about a child who is supposed to be placed with a family called Hartwell. The territorial office has received inquiries about her whereabouts." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. Someone was looking for her. Someone who might take her away from the only real home she'd ever known. "The Hartwells moved on months ago," Daniel replied calmly. "Lost their crops to fire and decided to try Oregon. Their cabin's been empty since last autumn." "Yes, I discovered that. But the child was definitely sent here. A girl, about 8 years old, from the Chicago orphanage. The territorial representative's records show she was delivered to this settlement." Emma pressed herself against the cabin wall, hardly daring to breathe. Through the open window, she could hear Sarah moving around inside, probably listening to every word. "Well now," Daniel said slowly, "that's interesting. Can't say as I've seen any unclaimed children wandering about. What's this regarding?" "There's been an inquiry from a family in Denver. Well-to-do people looking to adopt a child of that particular age and description. They're willing to pay handsomely for the privilege, and they've asked the territorial office to track down any suitable candidates." Emma's world tilted dangerously. Someone with money wanted to buy her, to take her away from Sarah and Daniel to a big city far from Montana. The thought made her feel sick with terror. "That's a shame," Daniel was saying, his voice still calm but with an edge Emma had never heard before. "Sounds like they're too late. Child like that probably got placed with a good family already." "That's what I'm trying to determine. The records are incomplete, and the representative who handled the case has since moved on to other employment. I'm conducting interviews with all the residents of this settlement to see if anyone knows what became of her." "Well, you're welcome to ask around," Daniel said. "Folks here are helpful sorts. But I can tell you right now, there ain't been any unclaimed children in this valley. If there had been, we'd have known about it." Emma heard the stranger's horse moving away, and she realized he was going door to door through the settlement. Her legs felt weak with fear. What if someone remembered seeing her arrive? What if Mrs. Petty mentioned the new daughter the Fletchers had suddenly acquired? What if the adoption papers weren't enough to protect her from people with more money and influence? She slipped through the back door of the cabin and found Sarah standing at the front window, her face pale with worry. "You heard?" Sarah asked softly. Emma nodded, unable to speak around the lump of fear in her throat. "Come here, sweet one." Sarah opened her arms, and Emma fled into them gratefully. "Listen to me carefully. You are our daughter now, legally and in every way that matters. Those papers we filed make it official. No one can take you away from us without our consent. But what if they have more money? What if they can pay more than you can?" Emma's voice was muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "Money don't make a family, Emma. Love does. And no amount of money can buy what we have together." Daniel came through the front door, his face grim but determined. "Emma, I need you to listen to me. If anyone asks you any questions, anyone at all, you tell them the truth. You're Emma Fletcher, our adopted daughter, and you've been living here since spring. Don't elaborate, don't volunteer extra information, just stick to the simple facts." "What if they don't believe me? Then we'll show them our adoption papers and our witness statements. Tom Bradley was here the day we filed those papers, and so was Pastor Williams. We've got plenty of folks who'll vouch for the fact that you're our daughter fair and square." But Emma could see the worry in both their faces, could hear the uncertainty beneath their reassuring words. For the first time since arriving at the Fletcher homestead, she felt the familiar chill of insecurity, the fear of having happiness snatched away just when she'd begun to believe it might last. The stranger spent 3 days in the settlement, asking questions and taking notes in a leather-bound book. Emma watched him from hiding places throughout the valley, her stomach knotted with anxiety every time he approached a neighbor's door. Mrs. Petty mentioned that the Fletchers had recently added to their family, but she spoke of Emma as their adopted daughter, not as a stray orphan. The Petty twins, when questioned, insisted they'd known Emma Fletcher for ages. Hadn't she always lived at the blacksmith's place? On the third evening, the stranger appeared at their door again, this time asking to speak with Emma directly. "This is my daughter," Daniel said firmly, his hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder as she stood between him and Sarah on the front porch. "Emma Fletcher. We adopted her through proper legal channels this past spring." The man studied Emma intently, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "How old are you, child?" "8, sir." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "And you've been living here how long?" "Since spring, sir. This is my home." "I see." He made a note in his book. "And before you came here?" Emma felt Sarah's hand tighten on her other shoulder. "I lived in Chicago, sir. But that was before Papa and Mama adopted me." It wasn't a lie, exactly. Chicago was part of her past, and Daniel and Sarah were her parents now. But she could see suspicion in the stranger's eyes. "I'll need to see the adoption papers," he said to Daniel. "Of course." Daniel disappeared into the cabin and returned with the official documents, properly stamped and signed by the territorial clerk. The stranger examined them carefully, holding them up to the lamplight. "These appear to be in order," he admitted reluctantly. "Though the timing is curious. Most adoptions take months to process, not weeks." "The clerk expedited our case when he saw how well Emma had settled in with us," Sarah said smoothly. "Sometimes these things just work out the way they're meant to." The stranger asked a few more questions, but the adoption papers were legally sound, and eventually he had no choice but to accept their validity. Emma held her breath, as he mounted his horse and prepared to leave. "If you should hear anything about unclaimed orphans in the area," he said as a parting shot, "the territorial office would appreciate being notified. There are good families willing to provide excellent opportunities for deserving children." "We'll keep that in mind," Daniel replied evenly. "Safe travels." They watched until the stranger disappeared down the valley road, and only then did Emma allow herself to breathe freely again. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "For now," Daniel said. "But Emma, this might not be the last time someone comes looking. There's money to be made in child placement, and some folks see opportunity where we see family. What do we do?" Sarah knelt in front of Emma, taking her hands firmly. "We live our lives, and we trust that the good Lord brought you to us for a reason. We're a family now, legally and in every other way. No amount of money or influence can change that." But that night, Emma heard her parents talking in hushed voices long after they thought she was asleep. "What if they come back with a court order?" Sarah whispered. "Then we'll fight it," Daniel replied firmly. "Emma belongs with us. Anyone with eyes can see how happy and healthy she's become here. But if they have connections, if they can manipulate the territorial government, then we'll take Emma and head north to Canada if we have to. I won't let anyone tear our family apart." The fierce protectiveness in Daniel's voice both comforted and frightened Emma. She'd never had anyone willing to fight for her before, but the thought of having to run, of becoming fugitives because of her, filled her with guilt and worry. The next few weeks passed in tense calm. No more strangers appeared asking questions, but Emma found herself looking over her shoulder more often, startling at unexpected sounds. The easy contentment of her first months with the Fletchers was shadowed now by the knowledge that their happiness was fragile, that forces beyond their control might still tear them apart. It was during this period of uncertainty that Emma discovered something that would change everything, a discovery that would test the strength of her new family's bonds and ultimately prove just how far love could triumph over law and money. She was exploring the abandoned Hartwell cabin one afternoon, drawn by curiosity about the family who should have been hers, when she noticed something glinting in the debris scattered across the floor. Pushing aside broken furniture and wind-blown leaves, she found a small metal box wedged beneath a loose floorboard. Inside the box were papers, official documents that made her heart race as she struggled to read the formal language. It took several attempts and careful sounding out of unfamiliar words, but gradually the meaning became clear. The documents revealed that the Hartwells had never actually applied to receive an orphan. The territorial representative had forged their request, intending to place Emma with a family in Denver who had offered substantial payment for a child of her description. But when the Hartwells had unexpectedly departed for Oregon, the representative had panicked and hidden the evidence of his scheme, planning to retrieve it later and claim Emma had simply vanished during transport. Emma stared at the papers with growing understanding and anger. She had been intended as merchandise, not as a daughter. Someone had tried to sell her to the highest bidder, and only the Hartwells' departure and her own desperate knock on the wrong door had saved her from that fate. But now she held proof of the conspiracy in her hands, proof that could protect her family from future interference if anyone came asking questions again. Racing home through the gathering dusk, Emma burst through the cabin door clutching the metal box to her chest. "Mama! Papa! You have to see this!" The excitement in her voice brought both Daniel and Sarah running, and as Emma spread the documents across the kitchen table, their faces transformed from confusion to understanding to righteous anger. "That snake," Daniel muttered, studying the forged papers. "He was selling children like livestock. But, Emma, don't you see what this means?" Sarah's voice was bright with hope and relief. "You were never supposed to go to Denver. You were never legally promised to anyone else. The whole thing was a fraud." Emma nodded eagerly. "And now we have proof. If anyone comes asking questions again, we can show them these papers and prove that you're my real parents, that there was never any legitimate claim on me by anyone else." Daniel gathered the documents carefully, his expression grim but satisfied. "We'll need to report this to the territorial authorities. That representative needs to face justice for what he's done, and there might be other children involved in his scheme." But first, Sarah said firmly, pulling Emma into a fierce hug, we need to celebrate. Because now there's no doubt, no question, no threat hanging over us. You're ours, Emma Fletcher, completely and forever. As autumn deepened into winter, the threat that had shadowed their happiness lifted completely. The corrupt territorial representative was arrested when other families came forward with similar stories, and an investigation revealed a network of child trafficking that had been operating throughout the Western Territories. Emma's discovery had not only secured her own future but had helped protect other vulnerable children from similar exploitation. The Denver family who had tried to buy Emma was censured by the territorial government and barred from future adoptions. Their money and influence counted for nothing when faced with evidence of their participation in illegal child trafficking. But for Emma, the most important victory was smaller and more personal. On Christmas morning, Sarah presented her with a beautiful quilt stitched with her new name, Emma Fletcher, surrounded by images of the Montana Valley she now called home. Every stitch was sewn with love, Sarah said as Emma traced the letters of her name with wondering fingers. Just like every day of your life from now on will be filled with love. Outside, snow fell softly over the Fletcher homestead, blanketing the valley in peaceful white. Inside the warm cabin, a family that had been formed by accident but strengthened by choice prepared to face the future together, secure in the knowledge that love had triumphed over law, that right had conquered might, and that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as mistakes. The territorial representative's error in documentation had sent an orphan to the wrong cabin, but Providence had guided her to exactly the right family, to people who would fight for her, protect her, and love her as their own daughter for all the days of their lives. The weeks that followed Emma's arrival passed like a sweet dream she was afraid to wake from. Spring melted into early summer, and with each passing day, the Fletcher homestead felt more like home than any place she'd ever known. Sarah taught her to churn butter and tend the vegetable garden, while Daniel showed her how to care for the animals and mend simple tools. Every evening after supper, they would gather around the table while Daniel read aloud from books Emma had never imagined existed. Stories of adventure and distant lands, poems that made her heart soar, and passages from scripture that spoke of God's love for his children. You're a quick learner, Emma, Sarah said one morning as they worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans and squash. Your mama taught you well before she passed. Emma's hands stilled on the soil. She rarely spoke of her mother anymore, the memories too precious and painful to share casually. She said reading was the key to everything. That no matter how poor we were, books could take us anywhere we wanted to go. She was a wise woman, Sarah replied gently, not pressing for more details. Would you like to write a letter to her grave? Sometimes it helps to put our thoughts on paper, even when the person can't write back. The idea had never occurred to Emma, but it felt right somehow. That evening, while Daniel worked on repairing a neighbor's plow by lamplight, Sarah sat with Emma at the kitchen table and helped her compose a letter to her mother's memory. Emma's handwriting was still uncertain, but the words came from her heart. Dear Mama, she wrote slowly, forming each letter with care. I found a family like you always said I would. They love me and want to keep me forever. I think you would like them very much. I miss you every day, but I'm not scared anymore. Sarah had to step outside when Emma read the letter aloud, and when she returned, her eyes were red but her smile was radiant. Your mama would be so proud of the young lady you're becoming. The letter was carefully folded and placed in Sarah's cedar chest alongside other precious documents. Daniel and Sarah's marriage certificate, deeds to their land, and the adoption papers they'd filed with the territorial office just 2 weeks after Emma's arrival. The clerk had been suspicious at first, questioning why the Fletchers suddenly wanted to adopt when they'd never expressed such interest before, but Daniel's reputation as an honest man and Sarah's obvious devotion to Emma had eventually swayed him. Papers are just papers, Daniel had said as they rode home from the territorial office that day. But love is what makes a family real. By midsummer, Emma had settled into the rhythm of homestead life as if she'd been born to it. She helped Sarah preserve vegetables from their abundant garden, learning to can beans and corn, to dry herbs and store root vegetables in the cool cellar Daniel had dug behind the house. She gathered eggs from their chickens each morning, speaking to them in the soft, patient voice Sarah had taught her to use with animals. They lay better when they feel safe, Sarah explained as Emma carefully lifted warm eggs from the nesting boxes. Animals can sense fear and anger just like people can. Speak gentle, move slow, and they'll trust you. The wisdom applied to more than chickens, Emma discovered. The neighboring families had initially been curious about the sudden appearance of a child at the Fletcher homestead, but Emma's quiet manners and willing helpfulness gradually won them over. Mrs. Petty, who lived 2 miles downstream, began asking Sarah to bring Emma along when she came calling. Old Tom Bradley, whose arthritis made shoeing his horses difficult, praised Emma's steady hand when she helped Daniel at the forge. "That girl's got a good heart and willing hands," he told Daniel one afternoon as Emma carefully held a horse's hoof while Daniel fitted a new shoe. "You and Sarah are blessed to have her." But it was the children of the settlement who truly accepted Emma without reservation. There were only a handful of them scattered across the valley: the Petty twins, Mary and Matthew, who were close to Emma's age; young Billy Henderson, barely 6 and full of mischief; and teenager Susan Crawford, who took Emma under her wing like an older sister. "Want to see something special?" Susan asked one afternoon when she'd come to visit while her father conducted business with Daniel. She led Emma to a hidden grove of cottonwoods along the creek, where wild roses bloomed in profusion and the sound of water over stones created a peaceful sanctuary. "This is where I come when I need to think," Susan confided as they settled on a fallen log. "My ma says every girl needs a secret place where she can be herself." Emma understood immediately. At the orphanage, privacy had been impossible, and even here at the Fletcher place, she sometimes felt the need to process her happiness, to make sure it was real and lasting. The grove became her refuge, a place where she could write in the journal Sarah had given her and practice reading aloud without fear of making mistakes. The journal had been a surprise gift one evening in late June. Sarah had presented it to Emma after supper, a small leather-bound book with blank pages waiting to be filled. "Every girl should have a place to keep her thoughts," Sarah had said. "Your mama would have wanted you to have this." Emma had treasured the journal from the first moment, filling its pages with careful observations about her new life. She wrote about learning to milk their cow, Buttercup, and how the animal had initially been skittish around her but had gradually come to trust her gentle hands. She recorded the different bird songs she was learning to identify and the names of wildflowers Sarah taught her during their walks along the creek. But most importantly, she wrote about the small daily kindnesses that made up her new life: the way Daniel always saved her the best biscuit at breakfast, how Sarah hummed while she worked and taught Emma the same songs, the evening ritual of family prayer that made Emma feel truly included and loved. As summer progressed into early autumn, Emma's life with the Fletchers took on a comfortable predictability that she treasured more than gold. Morning chores began before dawn with gathering eggs and helping Sarah prepare breakfast. After eating, Emma would spend the morning working in the garden or learning domestic skills like preserving food and mending clothes. Afternoons were often devoted to helping Daniel in his forge, where she proved surprisingly adept at organizing tools and assisting with simple tasks. The work was hard but satisfying in a way Emma had never experienced before. At the orphanage, chores had been drudgery performed under harsh supervision. Here, every task was part of maintaining their family's well-being, and Emma took pride in contributing meaningfully to their shared life. "You've got good instincts with the forge work," Daniel told her one afternoon as she successfully sorted a collection of damaged tools by the type of repair each would need. "Maybe I'll teach you some of the finer points when you're older." The idea of learning a trade, of having valuable skills that could support her throughout her life, filled Emma with excitement. At the orphanage, girls were taught only the most basic domestic tasks, with the expectation that they would become servants or marry young. But Daniel and Sarah spoke of her future with optimism, discussing possibilities she'd never dared imagine. That security was first threatened on a crisp September morning when a stranger rode into the settlement asking questions. Emma was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of an unfamiliar horse approaching. Through the fluttering sheets, she caught sight of a well-dressed man in a dark suit and city hat, the kind of man who represented authority and bureaucracy. Her blood turned cold as childhood instincts kicked in. Men like this one had taken her from her mother's deathbed, had loaded her onto the orphan train, had shuffled her from place to place like a piece of unwanted cargo. She crept closer to the cabin wall, straining to hear the conversation taking place on the front porch. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the rough logs, trying to make herself invisible. "Good morning," the stranger was saying to Daniel, who had emerged from his forge to greet the visitor. "I'm Samuel Harrison from the Territorial Placement Office. I'm looking for information about a child who was supposed to be placed with a family called Hartwell. The Territorial Office has received inquiries about her whereabouts." Emma's knees nearly buckled. Someone was looking for her. Someone who might take her away from the only real home she'd ever known. The carefully constructed piece of her new life suddenly felt as fragile as eggshells. "The Hartwells moved on months ago," Daniel replied calmly, though Emma could hear a subtle tension in his voice. "Lost their crops to fire and decided to try Oregon. Their cabin's been empty since last autumn." "Yes, I discovered that unfortunate situation. But the child was definitely sent here according to our records. A girl, about 8 years old, from the Chicago orphanage. The territorial representative's documentation shows she was delivered to this settlement in early spring." Emma pressed herself harder against the cabin wall, hardly daring to breathe. Through the open window, she could hear Sarah moving around inside, probably listening to every word while trying to appear busy with her normal household tasks. "Well now," Daniel said slowly, his voice taking on the careful neutrality Emma had heard him use with difficult customers. "That's interesting news. Can't say as I've seen any unclaimed children wandering about the valley. What's this inquiry regarding, if you don't mind me asking?" "There's been a request from a prominent family in Denver. Well-to-do people with excellent credentials who are looking to adopt a child of that particular age and description. They've contacted the Territorial Office and expressed their willingness to provide substantial compensation for the privilege of caring for such a child." Emma's world tilted dangerously. Someone with money wanted to buy her, to take her away from Sarah and Daniel to a big city far from Montana. The thought made her feel sick with terror and anger. She wasn't merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. "That's a real shame," Daniel was saying, his voice still calm but with an edge Emma had never heard before. "Sounds like those folks are too late. Child like that probably got placed with a good family already, especially if she arrived months ago like you said." "That's precisely what I'm trying to determine. The records from that period are somewhat incomplete, and the territorial representative who handled the case has since moved on to other employment. I'm conducting interviews with all the residents of this settlement to see if anyone has knowledge of what became of her." "Well, you're welcome to ask around," Daniel said. "Folks here are helpful sorts, always willing to lend a hand to someone in need. But I can tell you right now, there ain't been any unclaimed children in this valley. If there had been, we'd have known about it. News travels fast in a place this size." Emma heard the stranger's horse moving away, and she realized with growing panic that he was going door to door through the settlement. Her legs felt weak with fear. What if someone remembered seeing her arrive that first night? What if Mrs. Petty mentioned the new daughter the Fletchers had suddenly acquired? What if the adoption papers weren't enough to protect her from people with more money and influence? She slipped through the back door of the cabin and found Sarah standing at the front window, her face pale with worry but her posture determined. "You heard?" Sarah asked softly without turning around. Emma nodded, unable to speak around the lump of fear in her throat. "Come here, sweet one." Sarah opened her arms, and Emma fled into them gratefully, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and the comfort of unconditional love. "Listen to me carefully. You are our daughter now, legally and in every way that matters. Those papers we filed make it official. No one can take you away from us without our consent. But what if they have more money? What if they can pay the territorial office more than you can?" Emma's voice was muffled against Sarah's shoulder, but her fear was crystal clear. "Money don't make a family, Emma. Love does. And no amount of money in the world can buy what we have together." Sarah's voice was fierce with protective determination. "Besides, you're not for sale. You never were, and you never will be." Daniel came through the front door, his face grim but determined. He knelt in front of Emma, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Emma, I need you to listen to me carefully. If anyone asks you any questions, anyone at all, you tell them the simple truth. You're Emma Fletcher, our adopted daughter, and you've been living here since spring. Don't elaborate, don't volunteer extra information, just stick to those basic facts." "What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm lying? Then we'll show them our adoption papers and our witness statements. Tom Bradley was here the day we filed those papers, and so was Pastor Williams. We've got plenty of folks who'll vouch for the fact that you're our daughter fair and square." Daniel's voice was steady and reassuring, but Emma could see the worry in his eyes. "And if that's not enough?" Emma's question came out in a whisper. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look over Emma's head, and she saw something pass between them, a silent communication that spoke of absolute determination and unwavering commitment. "Then we'll fight," Daniel said simply. "We'll fight with everything we have, because that's what families do. They protect each other." But Emma could see the worry in both their faces, could hear the uncertainty beneath their reassuring words. For the first time since arriving at the Fletcher homestead, she felt the familiar chill of insecurity, the fear of having happiness snatched away just when she'd begun to believe it might last forever. The stranger spent 3 days in the settlement, methodically visiting every family and asking detailed questions. Emma watched him from various hiding places throughout the valley, her stomach knotted with anxiety every time he approached a neighbor's door. She saw him talking to Mrs. Petty for what seemed like hours, taking notes in his leather-bound book while the older woman gestured and explained. When Mrs. Petty mentioned that the Fletchers had recently added to their family, Emma's heart nearly stopped. But the neighbor woman spoke of Emma as their adopted daughter, not as a stray orphan who had appeared mysteriously in the spring. She praised Emma's good manners and helpful nature, describing her as a blessing to the childless couple who had opened their hearts and home to her. The Petty twins, when questioned separately, insisted they'd known Emma Fletcher for ages. Hadn't she always lived at the blacksmith's place? Their casual certainty was so convincing that even Emma almost believed they were telling the truth. Old Tom Bradley was even more helpful, spinning elaborate tales about how long he'd known the Fletcher family and how happy he was that they'd finally been blessed with a child. His stories were so detailed and delivered with such conviction that the stranger actually stopped taking notes and simply listened, nodding along with the old man's rambling narrative. But it was young Susan Crawford who provided the most convincing testimony. When the stranger questioned her about the settlement's children, she rattled off their names and ages with casual familiarity, including Emma as if she'd been part of the community forever. "Emma Fletcher? Oh yes, she's 8. Lives with her pa Daniel at the forge and her ma Sarah. Sweet girl, real helpful with the younger children." "Why do you ask?" The stranger's questions became more pointed, but Susan's answers remained consistent and believable. She spoke of Emma's arrival as if it had been a joyous family reunion rather than the desperate appearance of a lost orphan. On the 3rd evening, the stranger appeared at their door again, this time requesting to speak with Emma directly. Emma felt as if her heart might beat right out of her chest as she stood between Daniel and Sarah on the front porch, facing the man who represented everything she feared most: separation from her family. "This is my daughter," Daniel said firmly, his hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. "Emma Fletcher. We adopted her through proper legal channels this past spring." The man studied Emma intently with cold, calculating eyes that reminded her of the territorial representative who had first shuffled her like a piece of unwanted cargo. She forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, drawing strength from her parents' presence on either side of her. "How old are you, child?" 8 years old, sir." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "And you've been living here how long?" "Since spring, sir. This is my home." She emphasized the last word slightly, putting all her conviction behind it. "I see." He made a note in his book with a scratching sound that set Emma's teeth on edge. "And before you came to live here with the Fletchers?" Emma felt Sarah's hand tighten protectively on her other shoulder. She thought carefully before answering, remembering Daniel's advice to stick to simple facts. "I lived in Chicago, sir. But that was before Mama and Papa adopted me and brought me home." It wasn't a lie, exactly. Chicago was part of her past, and Daniel and Sarah were her parents now in every way that mattered. But she could see suspicion flickering in the stranger's eyes as he studied her carefully. "I'll need to examine the adoption papers," he said to Daniel, his tone suggesting he expected to find some irregularity that would support his suspicions. "Of course." Daniel disappeared into the cabin and returned with the official documents, properly stamped and signed by the territorial clerk. The stranger examined them carefully under the lamplight, holding them up to check for forgeries or alterations. "These appear to be legitimate," he admitted reluctantly after several minutes of scrutiny. "Though I must say, the timing is rather curious. Most adoption proceedings take months to process through proper channels, not mere weeks." "The clerk expedited our case when he saw how well Emma had settled in with us," Sarah said smoothly, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal pride. "Sometimes these things just work out the way the good Lord intends them to." The stranger asked several more probing questions, but the adoption papers were legally sound and properly executed. There was nothing he could point to as evidence of fraud or impropriety. Eventually, he had no choice but to accept their validity, though his frustration was evident. Emma held her breath as he closed his notebook and prepared to leave, mounting his horse with obvious reluctance. "If you should hear anything about unclaimed orphans in the area," he said as a parting shot, "the territorial office would appreciate being notified immediately. There are excellent families willing to provide superior opportunities for deserving children." The implication was clear. He believed the Fletchers were somehow inferior to his wealthy clients in Denver, that Emma would be better off with people who had more money if not more love. "We'll keep that in mind," Daniel replied evenly, his voice giving nothing away. "Safe travels to you." They watched in tense silence until the stranger disappeared down the valley road, swallowed by the gathering darkness. Only then did Emma allow herself to breathe freely again. "Is it over?" she asked quietly, her voice small and uncertain. "For now," Daniel said, pulling her into a protective embrace. "But Emma, this might not be the last time someone comes looking. There's money to be made in child placement, and some folks see opportunity where we see family. What do we do if they come back?" Sarah knelt in front of Emma, taking her hands firmly in her own. "We live our lives, and we trust that the good Lord brought you to us for a reason. We're a family now, legally and in every other way that matters. No amount of money or influence can change that." But that night, Emma heard her parents talking in hushed voices long after they thought she was asleep. Their bedroom was directly across the small hallway from hers, and their worried whispers carried clearly through the thin walls. "What if they come back with a court order?" Sarah's voice was tight with anxiety. "Then we'll fight it in court," Daniel replied firmly. "Emma belongs with us. Anyone with eyes can see how happy and healthy she's become here. But if they have political connections, if they can manipulate the territorial government or find some legal loophole, then we'll take Emma and head north to Canada if we have to. My brother lives in Alberta, and they'd welcome us there. I won't let anyone tear our family apart, not for all the money in the world." The fierce protectiveness in Daniel's voice both comforted and frightened Emma. She'd never had anyone willing to fight for her before, willing to sacrifice their own security for her sake. But the thought of having to run, of becoming fugitives because of her presence, filled her with guilt and worry. The next few weeks passed in a state of tense vigilance. No more strangers appeared asking questions, but Emma found herself looking over her shoulder more often, startling at unexpected sounds. The easy contentment of her first months with the Fletchers was shadowed now by the knowledge that their happiness was fragile, that forces beyond their control might still tear them apart. It was during this period of uncertainty that Emma made a discovery that would change everything, a discovery that would test the strength of her new family's bonds and ultimately prove just how far love could triumph over law and money. She was exploring the abandoned Hartwell cabin one afternoon in late September, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the need to understand more about the family who should have been hers according to the original territorial paperwork. The cabin was in worse condition than she'd initially realized, with broken windows and a roof that leaked in several places. Debris was scattered across the floor, broken furniture, torn papers, and the detritus of a family's hasty departure. As she picked her way carefully through the wreckage, something glinted in the afternoon sunlight streaming through a hole in the roof. Pushing aside a broken chair and a pile of wind-blown leaves, she discovered a small metal box wedged beneath a loose floorboard. The box was locked, but the metal had corroded enough that Emma was able to pry it open with a piece of broken iron from the fireplace tools. Inside were papers, official documents that made her heart race as she struggled to read the formal language and official terminology. It took several attempts and careful sounding out of unfamiliar words, but gradually the meaning of the documents became horrifyingly clear. The papers revealed a conspiracy that made her blood run cold with anger and understanding. The Hartwells had never actually applied to receive an orphan through the Territorial Placement Program. The request bearing their name was a forgery, created by the same territorial representative who had processed Emma's placement. The real purpose had been to facilitate the illegal sale of orphan children to wealthy families willing to pay substantial sums for the privilege of adoption. Emma had been intended as merchandise in a human trafficking operation that stretched across multiple territories. The representative had forged the Hartwell request as a cover story, planning to deliver her directly to the Denver family who had already paid handsomely for a child matching her description. But when the Hartwells had unexpectedly departed for Oregon before Emma's arrival, the representative had panicked. Rather than admit his illegal activities, he had decided to let Emma disappear into the bureaucratic confusion, planning to return later and destroy the evidence once the situation had cooled down. The metal box had been his insurance policy, containing all the documentation of his criminal enterprise in case he needed leverage or proof of his client's complicity. Emma stared at the papers with growing understanding and righteous anger. She had been treated as property, valued only for the money her sale would bring. The stranger who had questioned the settlement hadn't been conducting a routine inquiry. He had been trying to recover valuable merchandise that had gone missing from an illegal transaction. But now she held proof of the entire conspiracy in her trembling hands, proof that could protect her family from future interference and expose the criminals who preyed on vulnerable children. Racing home through the gathering dusk, Emma burst through the cabin door clutching the metal box to her chest like a treasure beyond price. "Mama! Papa! You have to see this!" The excitement and urgency in her voice brought both Daniel and Sarah running from their evening chores. As Emma spread the documents across the kitchen table with shaking hands, their faces transformed from confusion to understanding to righteous anger. "That snake," Daniel muttered, studying the forged papers with growing fury. "He was selling children like they were livestock at auction." "But, Emma, don't you see what this means?" Sarah's voice was bright with hope and relief as the implications became clear. "You were never supposed to go to Denver. You were never legally promised to anyone else. The whole thing was a fraud from beginning to end." Emma nodded eagerly, her heart soaring with vindication and relief. "And now we have proof. If anyone comes asking questions again, we can show them these papers and prove that you're my real parents, that there was never any legitimate claim on me by anyone else." Daniel gathered the documents carefully, his expression grim but deeply satisfied. "We'll need to report this to the proper territorial authorities, the honest ones, not the corrupt officials who were part of this scheme. That representative needs to face justice for what he's done, and there might be other children involved in his operation who need protection." "But first," Sarah said firmly, pulling Emma into a fierce hug that conveyed all her relief and love, "we need to celebrate. Because now there's no doubt, no question, no threat hanging over our heads. You're ours, Emma Fletcher, completely and forever." The investigation that followed Emma's discovery sent shockwaves through the territorial government and resulted in multiple arrests and prosecutions. The corrupt representative was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and several wealthy families were exposed as participants in the illegal child trafficking network. The Denver family who had tried to purchase Emma was not only censured by the territorial government but faced criminal charges for their role in human trafficking. Their money and social influence counted for nothing when faced with evidence of their participation in such despicable crimes against children. As autumn deepened into winter, the threat that had shadowed the Fletcher family's happiness lifted completely, replaced by a security and peace that felt unshakable. The legal victory was satisfying, but for Emma, the most important triumph was smaller and more personal. The absolute certainty that she truly belonged with Daniel and Sarah Fletcher, not because of legal papers or court decisions, but because of the unbreakable bonds of love they had forged together. Winter settled over the Bear Creek Valley like a gentle benediction, bringing with it a peace and contentment that Emma treasured more than any material wealth. The long, quiet evenings were filled with the simple pleasures of family life. Daniel reading aloud by the fireplace while Sarah worked on her endless mending, and Emma practiced her letters in her precious journal. On Christmas morning, Sarah presented Emma with a beautiful quilt stitched with her name, Emma Fletcher, surrounded by images of the Montana Valley she now called home. Every piece of fabric had been chosen with care, every stitch sewn with love and hope for the future. Every stitch was sewn with love, Sarah said as Emma traced the letters of her name with wondering fingers. Just like every day of your life from now on will be filled with love and belonging. Outside, snow fell softly over the Fletcher homestead, blanketing the valley in peaceful white. Inside the warm cabin, a family that had been formed by accident but strengthened by choice prepared to face the future together, secure in the knowledge that love had triumphed over greed, that right had conquered might, and that sometimes the most precious gifts in life come disguised as bureaucratic mistakes. The territorial representative's error in documentation had indeed sent an orphan to the wrong cabin, but divine providence had guided her footsteps to exactly the right family, to people who would fight for her, protect her, and love her as their own daughter through all the seasons of their lives together. Spring returned to the Bear Creek Valley with a glory that seemed to celebrate the Fletcher family's hard-won peace. Emma, now 9 years old and taller by several inches, worked alongside Sarah in their expanded garden, planting rows of vegetables that would feed them through the coming year. The threat that had once shadowed their happiness was nothing but a memory now, replaced by the solid certainty of belonging and the quiet joy of daily life lived in love. "We'll need more preserving jars this year," Sarah observed as they planted the third row of green beans. "With you eating like you do now, our winter stores won't last unless we put up twice what we did before." Emma grinned at the gentle teasing. After months of proper meals and the security of knowing where her next meal would come from, she had indeed grown considerably. Her face had filled out, losing the hollow-cheeked look of chronic hunger, and her arms and legs had gained the sturdy strength that came from regular food and honest work. "I can help with the preserving," Emma offered eagerly. "Last year I was too little to handle the hot jars, but now I'm big enough to help proper." "That you are, sweet one. Getting to be quite the young lady." Sarah's voice carried the pride and satisfaction of a mother watching her daughter grow and flourish. "Pastor Williams stopped by yesterday while you were helping your papa at the forge. The school he's been planning is finally going to happen come fall. 5 families have committed, and they're going to build a proper schoolhouse right here in the settlement." Emma's heart leaped with excitement. She'd been learning steadily under Daniel and Sarah's patient instruction, but the prospect of formal schooling, of learning alongside other children, filled her with anticipation. "Will I be able to go?" "Really and truly." "Of course you will. Every child deserves proper schooling, and you've got a fine mind that needs cultivating." Sarah paused in her planting to look directly at Emma, her expression serious but loving. "Your mama was right about education being the key to everything. We aim to see you get every opportunity to use that key." The promise of school was just one of many ways Emma's life continued to expand and deepen. Daniel had begun teaching her more advanced blacksmithing skills, showing her how to judge the temperature of iron by its color and how to shape metal with careful, measured strikes. She was still too small to work the heavy pieces, but her deft hands were perfect for delicate repair work and fine detail. "You've got natural talent for this," Daniel told her one afternoon as she successfully straightened a series of bent nails with patient, careful taps. "Not everyone has the touch for metalwork, but you seem to understand what the iron wants to become." The praise warmed Emma's heart, but more than that, she treasured the time spent working beside Daniel in the forge. These quiet afternoons, with the rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil and the comfortable presence of her father nearby, had become some of her most cherished moments. As spring progressed into summer, Emma found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this place of belonging. Sometimes, when she was alone in her secret grove by the creek, she would take out her journal and try to capture in words the gratitude that filled her heart to overflowing. I used to think happiness was just not being hungry or scared, she wrote one afternoon in early June. Now I know it's much more than that. It's knowing that tomorrow will be like today, full of love and work and family. It's knowing that Papa will smile when I bring him his dinner at the forge, and Mama will hum while she teaches me to make bread. It's knowing that I belong here not because I'm useful, but because I'm loved. The settlement had grown over the past year, with 2 new families arriving to try their luck in the Montana Territory. The Hendersons had built a cabin upstream from the Fletchers and established a small sawmill that provided lumber for the growing community. The Martins had claimed land on the other side of the creek and were raising sheep, adding the sound of bleating animals to the familiar symphony of frontier life. Emma found herself serving as an unofficial guide and friend to the new children, sharing her knowledge of the best fishing spots, the location of wild berry patches, and the safest trails through the surrounding hills. Her role as one of the older, established children in the community gave her a sense of belonging and purpose that would have been unimaginable during her orphan train days. "You're good with the little ones," Susan Crawford observed as they watched Emma patiently teach 6-year-old Tommy Martin how to braid grass into rope. At 14, Susan was preparing to marry young Jake Morrison in the fall, and she'd begun to see the world through the eyes of someone who would soon have children of her own. "I remember what it was like to be new and scared," Emma replied simply. "Nobody should have to feel that way if they don't have to." The wisdom in her words, born from experiences no child should have had to endure, struck Susan as both heartbreaking and inspiring. Emma Fletcher had survived abandonment and uncertainty to find her place in the world, and she was determined to make that world a little kinder for other vulnerable children. As summer reached its peak, the Fletcher family received news that would test their happiness in an entirely different way than the previous year's threats. A letter arrived from Chicago, forwarded through several territorial offices, bearing the seal of the orphanage where Emma had spent her darkest months. Daniel read the letter aloud at the supper table, his voice carefully neutral as he worked through the formal language and official terminology. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher," he began. "We have received notification through official channels that one Emma Fletcher, formerly Emma Morrison, was placed with your family through territorial adoption proceedings. We write to inform you that we have located relatives of the child who wish to make contact and potentially assume guardianship." Emma's fork clattered to her plate, her appetite vanishing instantly. She had no relatives that she knew of. Her mother had been alone in the world except for Emma herself. The individual in question is one Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who claims to be the child's paternal grandmother. She has provided documentation of her relationship and has expressed her desire to provide a home for her granddaughter. We request that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for the child's evaluation and potential placement with her blood relative. Silence fell over the Fletcher kitchen like a heavy blanket. Emma stared at her parents, seeing her own shock and fear reflected in their faces. "I don't understand," Emma whispered. "Mama never mentioned any grandmother. She always said we were alone in the world." Sarah reached across the table to take Emma's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Maybe your mama didn't know this woman was alive. Maybe she thought Emma, your papa, had no family left. Or maybe," Daniel said grimly, folding the letter with deliberate care, "this woman wasn't someone your mama wanted in your life." The possibility hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Emma tried to remember anything her mother might have said about her father's family, but there was nothing. Her mother had spoken lovingly of Emma's father, describing him as a good man who had died in a factory accident before Emma was born, but she had never mentioned his relatives. "What does this mean?" Emma asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Do I have to go with her?" Daniel and Sarah exchanged the kind of meaningful look that had become their wordless communication over the years of their marriage. "Not if we can help it," Daniel said firmly. "You're our daughter now, legally adopted and properly documented. This woman would have to prove not only her relationship to you, but also that it would be in your best interests to leave a loving home for an uncertain future with a stranger." "But she's family," Emma said, the word feeling strange and foreign in her mouth. "Doesn't that mean something legally?" "Blood don't always make family, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "Love does. And this woman, if she really is your grandmother, Where was she when your mama was dying of consumption in a Chicago tenement? Where was she when you were sent to the orphanage? Where was she during all those months you suffered before finding your way to us? The questions hung unanswered, but their implications were clear. If this Catherine Morrison was truly Emma's grandmother, she had made no effort to help when Emma and her mother desperately needed family support. We'll write to the orphanage, Daniel decided. We'll explain that Emma is settled and thriving with us, that she's been legally adopted, and that any change in her circumstances would need to be justified by compelling evidence that it would serve her best interests. But even as he spoke with confidence, Emma could see the worry lines creasing Daniel's forehead. They had fought one battle for their family and won, but this new challenge felt different, more personal and potentially more dangerous. The response from Chicago came more quickly than expected, and with it came a shock that none of them had anticipated. The letter was not from the orphanage officials but from Catherine Morrison herself, written in an educated hand on expensive paper. "My dear granddaughter," Daniel read aloud, his voice tight with growing anger. "I was heartbroken to learn of my son's death and my dear daughter-in-law's subsequent passing. I have spent considerable time and expense locating you, only to discover that you have been placed with strangers in the wilderness. As your only living blood relative, I feel it is my Christian duty to provide you with the advantages of civilization and proper society that you deserve as a Morrison." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The letter's tone was formal and possessive, speaking of duty and advantage rather than love and family. "I have made arrangements to travel to Montana Territory to collect you personally," Daniel continued reading. "I trust that your current guardians, while no doubt well-meaning, will understand that a child's place is with her true family. I am prepared to compensate them for any expenses they have incurred in your care, and I assure you that you will want for nothing as part of my household in Philadelphia." Philadelphia! Emma gasped. The city might as well have been on the moon for all the connection she felt to it. Sarah was on her feet instantly, pacing the small kitchen with the restless energy of a mother animal protecting her young. "She speaks of you like you're a piece of property to be collected. Not a word about what you might want or how you might feel about leaving your home. And notice," Daniel added grimly, "how she assumes we'll be willing to hand you over for the right compensation. She thinks everything can be bought and sold." Emma stared at the letter as if it were a snake that might bite her. This grandmother she'd never known existed was planning to uproot her from the only real family she'd ever known, to take her away from Montana to a strange city where she would be alone again among strangers. "I won't go," she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "I don't care if she is my grandmother. This is my home, and you're my family. I won't leave you. And we won't let her take you," Sarah said fiercely, ceasing her pacing to kneel beside Emma's chair. "Not without a fight that'll make last year's troubles look like a church social." But Daniel was studying the letter more carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "She mentions that she's already contacted territorial authorities and that she has legal representation. This woman isn't just hoping to appeal to our sympathy, she's preparing for a legal battle." The implications of his words settled over the family like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Catherine Morrison wasn't just a grieving grandmother seeking to reconnect with lost family. She was a wealthy woman with the resources to wage a legal war for custody, and she apparently had no qualms about using those resources. What kind of legal claim could she have? Emma asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "Blood relation carries weight in territorial law," Daniel admitted reluctantly. "If she can prove she's your grandmother and that she can provide for you financially, some judges might consider that sufficient grounds for changing your custody." "Even though I'm already legally adopted?" Adoption law in the territories is still developing. Some judges respect the finality of adoption papers, while others believe blood family takes precedence unless there's clear evidence of abuse or neglect. Sarah stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and determination. "Then we'll make sure any judge who hears this case understands exactly what kind of life Emma has here, and what kind of woman would try to tear a child away from a loving home." Over the next several days, the Fletcher family worked with quiet determination to prepare for the legal battle they knew was coming. Daniel consulted with Pastor Williams, who had some knowledge of territorial law from his previous work as a court clerk. Sarah began collecting testimony from neighbors and friends who could speak to Emma's happiness and well-being in their care. Emma herself took on the task of writing her own statement, carefully documenting her memories of life before the Fletchers and her experiences since joining their family. The exercise forced her to confront painful memories she'd tried to forget, but it also helped her articulate just how much her life had changed for the better. "I was hungry most of the time before I came here," she wrote in her careful script. "Not just for food, though there was never enough of that, but hungry for someone to care if I was safe or sick or scared. Mama and Papa Fletcher don't just feed my body, they feed my soul with love and belonging. They've given me a home, not just a place to stay." The testimony from neighbors was overwhelmingly supportive. Mrs. Petty wrote a long letter describing Emma's transformation from a frightened, withdrawn child to a confident, helpful young lady. Tom Bradley provided a sworn statement about Emma's character and the obvious love between her and her adoptive parents. Even the newer families in the settlement, who had known Emma for less than a year, wrote letters praising her kindness to their children and her integration into the community. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Susan Crawford, now planning her own wedding and thinking seriously about the children she hoped to have someday, wrote a letter that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Emma Fletcher is the kind of daughter every parent dreams of having," Susan wrote. "She's kind without being weak, helpful without being servile, and wise beyond her years without being bitter. But more than that, she's happy. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with the Fletcher family can see the love that binds them together. To break up that family would be nothing short of cruel." As they prepared their defense, the Fletchers also had to confront the practical realities of their situation. Legal battles cost money, and while Daniel's blacksmithing provided a steady income, they were far from wealthy. The prospect of hiring lawyers and traveling to territorial court hearings was daunting. It was Pastor Williams who provided the solution, suggesting they contact a lawyer in Helena who had a reputation for taking cases involving children's welfare. Attorney Marcus Webb was known throughout the territory for his passionate defense of family rights and his willingness to work with clients of modest means. The letter from Attorney Webb arrived just 3 days before Catherine Morrison was scheduled to reach the settlement. His response was encouraging but realistic about the challenges they faced. "The law in these matters is evolving," he wrote, "and much will depend on the specific judge assigned to hear the case. However, your adoption appears to be legally sound, and the evidence of Emma's well-being in your care is compelling. I am prepared to represent your family in this matter." Emma felt a mixture of hope and apprehension as she read the lawyer's letter. She trusted Daniel and Sarah completely, but the legal system that had failed her so catastrophically in the past felt like an unpredictable and dangerous force. Catherine Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August, traveling in a hired coach that was far grander than anything the settlement had ever seen. Emma watched from the forge where she was helping Daniel repair a broken wheel, her stomach churning with nervousness as the elegant vehicle rolled to a stop in front of their cabin. The woman who emerged from the coach was nothing like Emma had expected. She was tall and imposing, dressed in expensive black silk that spoke of wealth and social position. Her gray hair was swept back in an elaborate style, and her face bore the stern expression of someone accustomed to having her wishes obeyed without question. But it was her eyes that struck Emma most forcefully, cold blue eyes that assessed everything they saw with calculating precision. There was no warmth in those eyes, no grandmother's joy at seeing a long-lost grandchild. Instead, Emma saw the same cold evaluation she remembered from the Orphan train platforms, the look of adults deciding whether she was worth their time and trouble. "That must be her," Daniel said quietly, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Stay close, Emma. Remember, no matter what she says or promises, you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go." They walked together toward the cabin, where Sarah was already greeting their unwelcome visitor with cool politeness. Catherine Morrison's gaze fixed immediately on Emma, studying her with an intensity that made Emma want to hide behind Daniel's broad shoulders. "So you are Emma," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of wealth and education. "You have the Morrison features, certainly. You look very much like your father did at your age." Emma found her voice with some difficulty. Yes, ma'am. I'm Emma Fletcher. Catherine Morrison's lips tightened almost imperceptibly at the emphasis on the surname. Morrison, child. You are Emma Morrison, granddaughter of Catherine Morrison and daughter of my late son, James Morrison. I'm Emma Fletcher, Emma repeated with quiet stubbornness, moving closer to Sarah's protective presence. These are my parents. The older woman's gaze swept dismissively over Daniel and Sarah, taking in their work-worn clothes and calloused hands with obvious disdain. I'm sure these people have been kind to you, child, but they are not your family. I am your family, your only blood relative, and I have come to take you home where you belong. This is my home, Emma said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I belong here, with Mama and Papa Fletcher. Catherine Morrison's expression hardened. You belong with your own kind, among people of breeding and education who can provide you with the advantages your birth entitles you to receive. This wilderness existence may seem adequate to you now, but you deserve so much more. Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but steel-edged. Emma has everything she needs here, Mrs. Morrison. She has love, security, education, and a community that values her for who she is. She has provincial mediocrity when she could have genuine culture and refinement, Catherine Morrison replied sharply. She could attend the finest schools, wear beautiful clothes, move in the best social circles. Instead, she's buried in this godforsaken wilderness, learning to be a common laborer's daughter. Daniel's jaw tightened at the insult, but his voice remained level. We're proud of the education we've given Emma, and we're proud of the young lady she's becoming. She's happy here, which seems to matter less to you than her potential social standing. Happiness is a luxury, Mr. Fletcher. Security and position are necessities. I can provide Emma with both, along with the connections and opportunities that will serve her throughout her life. Emma listened to the adults argue about her future as if she weren't there, and she felt an familiar anger building in her chest. Once again, adults were making decisions about her life based on what they thought was best, without regard for what she actually wanted. I don't want connections and opportunities, she said loudly, interrupting the conversation. I want to stay with my family. I want to go to school here in the settlement and learn blacksmithing from Papa and preserving from Mama. I want to grow up here, where people know me and love me. Catherine Morrison looked at Emma with something approaching pity. Child, you don't understand what you're rejecting. In Philadelphia, you would have every advantage: music lessons, proper deportment training, introduction to the finest families. You could marry well, live in comfort, want for nothing. I don't want for nothing now, Emma replied stubbornly. I have everything I need right here. You have ignorance and isolation. You're becoming a frontier peasant when you could be a refined lady. The contempt in her grandmother's voice struck Emma like a physical blow. This woman saw everything Emma valued, her family, her home, her community, as worthless obstacles to be overcome. I'd rather be a frontier peasant with people who love me than a refined lady with someone who thinks I'm a prize to be won, Emma said with a dignity that surprised even herself. Catherine Morrison's face flushed with anger at the child's defiance. You will come with me, Emma Morrison, because I am your legal guardian by right of blood. These people have no claim on you that supersedes mine. Actually, ma'am, they do. Attorney Webb's voice cut through the tension as he approached the group with confident strides. He was a lean man with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. I represent the Fletcher family, and I can assure you that Emma's adoption is legally binding and properly executed. Catherine Morrison's eyes narrowed as she assessed this new opponent. And I can assure you, Mr. Webb, that I have retained the finest legal representation available in the territory. Blood relationship trumps adoption in any reasonable court of law. We'll let the court decide that, won't we? Webb replied pleasantly. In the meantime, Emma remains with her legal guardians pending judicial review. The battle lines were drawn, and Emma found herself once again at the center of a legal struggle that would determine her entire future. But this time, she wasn't a frightened orphan with no one to speak for her. This time, she had a family willing to fight for her, a community that supported her, and her own voice to speak her truth. The court hearing was scheduled for the following month in Helena, the territorial capital. Catherine Morrison took rooms at the settlement's only boarding house, making it clear that she had no intention of leaving without Emma. Her presence cast a shadow over the entire community, and Emma found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from a woman who seemed to view her as a disappointing investment in need of improvement. "Your posture is atrocious," Catherine Morrison observed one afternoon when she encountered Emma returning from her chores at the forge. "And your complexion has been ruined by all this outdoor labor. In Philadelphia, you would learn to carry yourself like a lady." Emma straightened her shoulders but didn't respond. She had learned that arguing with her grandmother only led to longer lectures about her many deficiencies and the superior life that awaited her in Pennsylvania. As the day of the hearing approached, Emma found herself torn between hope and fear. She trusted Attorney Webb and believed in the strength of her adoption papers, but she had learned not to trust the legal system that had failed her so completely in the past. The night before they were to depart for Helena, Emma sat in her secret grove by the creek, writing in her journal by moonlight. "Tomorrow will decide everything," she wrote. "Either I'll come home to the family I choose, or I'll be taken away to live with a stranger who thinks she owns me because we share blood. I'm not afraid of Catherine Morrison. She's cold and mean, but she's not cruel like some of the people I've known. I'm afraid of losing the only real home I've ever had." The courtroom in Helena was intimidating, with high ceilings and formal furnishings that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and insignificant. Emma sat between Daniel and Sarah in the gallery, wearing her best dress and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Catherine Morrison's lawyer was everything Webb had warned them to expect: expensive, polished, and utterly convinced of his client's superiority. He presented his case with theatrical flair, painting Emma as a victim of circumstances who deserved rescue from her primitive conditions. "This child is the granddaughter of one of Philadelphia's most respected families," he argued. "She has been condemned to a life of hardship and ignorance through a series of bureaucratic failures. Mrs. Morrison offers her the life she was born to live: education, refinement, and social position." Attorney Webb's response was quieter but more powerful. He spoke of love, of belonging, of a child who had found her place in the world and was thriving in ways that money couldn't buy. "Emma Fletcher is not a prize to be claimed or a possession to be recovered," he told the judge. "She is a child who has found her family and her home. The question before this court is not whether blood relationship grants certain rights, but whether those rights supersede a child's right to remain with a family that has loved and nurtured her." The testimony phase of the hearing was emotional and compelling. Neighbors from the settlement had traveled to Helena to speak on Emma's behalf, describing her happiness and growth in the Fletcher home. Pastor Williams testified about her eagerness to learn and her kind treatment of other children. Even Dr. Harrison, who had examined Emma just days before the hearing, testified that she was healthy, well-nourished, and showed no signs of neglect or abuse. Catherine Morrison's witnesses spoke of her wealth, her social position, and her ability to provide material advantages that the Fletchers could never match. But they could not speak to her love for Emma, because there was none evident in her cold, calculating approach to the case. When Emma was called to testify on her own behalf, she felt the weight of her entire future resting on her words. The judge, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, spoke to her gently. "Emma, I want you to tell me in your own words where you want to live and why." Emma took a deep breath and spoke from her heart. "Your Honor, I want to live with Mama and Papa Fletcher because they're my real family. Not because of blood, but because of love. They chose me when nobody else wanted me, and they've given me everything I need to be happy. Mrs. Morrison is my grandmother, and I respect that, but she doesn't know me or love me. She wants to change everything about me and take me away from everyone I care about. That's not what family does." The judge listened carefully to Emma's testimony, asking thoughtful questions about her life with the Fletchers and her feelings about the proposed move to Philadelphia. Emma answered honestly, describing both her gratitude for her current life and her fear of being uprooted again. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced that he would take the matter under advisement and render his decision within a week. The wait felt endless to Emma and her family, but Attorney Webb was cautiously optimistic. The judge asked good questions, he told them as they prepared to return to the settlement. He seemed more interested in Emma's well-being than in abstract legal principles. The decision, when it came, was everything Emma had hoped for but hardly dared to expect. Judge Matthews ruled that while Catherine Morrison's blood relationship to Emma was undisputed, the child's best interests were clearly served by remaining with her adoptive family. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates conclusively that Emma Fletcher is thriving in her current environment, the judge wrote in his opinion. She has formed strong emotional bonds with her adoptive parents and has integrated successfully into her community. While Mrs. Morrison's desire to provide for her granddaughter is commendable, the court finds no compelling reason to disrupt a stable, loving family arrangement. The ruling was final and binding, establishing precedent for similar cases throughout the territory. Catherine Morrison's wealth and social position had been no match for the simple truth of a child's happiness and the power of genuine family love. Emma's grandmother departed for Philadelphia the following day, expressing her disappointment in the territorial legal system but accepting defeat with cold dignity. She left behind a bank draft for Emma's future education, a gesture that might have been intended as generosity but felt more like a final attempt to buy influence. "She's not a bad woman," Sarah said as they watched the elegant coach disappear down the valley road. "Just a woman who thinks everything can be bought and owned." "Including family," Daniel added. "But love don't work that way." Emma nodded, understanding more about the nature of family than many adults ever learned. She had discovered that the strongest bonds weren't those of blood or law, but those forged in the daily crucible of shared life, in morning chores and evening stories, in patient teaching and gentle correction, in the quiet certainty that someone would always be there when needed. As autumn settled over the Bear Creek Valley once again, Emma began her first year of formal schooling in the new schoolhouse that had been built at the heart of the settlement. She excelled in her studies, particularly in reading and writing, but her favorite subject was the practical mathematics that Daniel taught her at the forge. "You've got a head for figures and a heart for craftsmanship," he told her one afternoon as she successfully calculated the precise measurements for a complex repair job. "That's a combination that'll serve you well no matter what path you choose in life." Emma smiled at the praise, but more than that, she treasured the assumption behind it, that she would have choices to make, paths to explore, a future to build according to her own dreams and desires. On Christmas Eve, as the Fletcher family gathered around their tree to exchange simple gifts and share the story of another child who had found refuge far from where he was expected to be, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of perfect belonging. The territorial representative's careless mistake had indeed sent an orphan to the wrong cabin, but in the mysterious workings of Providence, it had been exactly the right mistake at exactly the right time. She had found her way not to the family that law and bureaucracy had chosen for her, but to the family that love and need had created for each other. As Daniel read the familiar words about shepherds and angels, about a young mother finding no room at the inn but making a family anyway in the humblest of circumstances, Emma understood that the most important families were often the ones that formed themselves, bound together not by blood or convenience but by the transforming power of choosing to love and be loved in return. Outside, snow fell softly over the Montana Valley that had become her true home, and inside the warm cabin, a family that had been formed by accident but chosen by love prepared to face whatever future awaited them, secure in the knowledge that they belonged to each other completely and forever. The wrong cabin had become the right home, and Emma Fletcher knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.